You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale. And you will atone.
It's been a long time, Simon.
So, the reason you're here with me and not in some vassal state being tortured is because the GSA needs your help. We're being overrun by a group of hackers, and they appear to be advancing their abilities faster than we can counter.
Orion.
That's right. Orion.
We've been tracking them for years. Blood-eyed anarchists. They want to return civilization to the Stone Age.
We figure if they continue their rate of progress, we only have a few weeks before they breach, taking control of our systems.
That'd be bad.
Hence our priorities. As aggravating as your little Concordia project has been, you were never this distasteful.
You do realize that even if Orion is stopped, another insurgency, likely more malicious, is just around the corner, right?
Your point?
My point is one way to measure the integrity of a society is by how many outliers it creates. Violent criminals, inner-city gangs, serial killers, mass murderers, terrorists, to now this lovely hacker dystopia you've inspired. You have a systemic problem, Simon, and it's only going to grow.
You're looking through the wrong lens, John.
And unlike the past, the outliers now have exponentially advancing technology. Some disgruntled kid fashioning a Molotov cocktail years ago can now create weapons of mass destruction, or in this case, weapons of mass disturbance with little more effort.
Again, you're looking through the wrong lens. No one ever said the natural course of humanity was going to be pretty.
So it's natural for humanity to flirt with its own destruction? And increasingly so? Because that's where all this leads.
Since the dawn of civilization, those with the most advanced tools are the ones who set the stage. From the rock, to the sword, to the gun, to the bomb, to AI. A sociological law of nature rooted in our evolutionary psychology. And if this race happens to lead to destruction, well, such is the natural course. Only human conceit assumes otherwise.
So you haven't lost that charming nihilism?
Drink.
No.
And it's not nihilism, John. It's realism. Conflict is what makes the world go round. And whomever wins defines the course.
So what's the deal?
The deal is you help us tame the barbarians at the gate along with anything else we ask. In return, you'll be granted a decent life here. This ship might be a place of work, but it's also a self-contained city. We go back a long way, John. And despite our differences, I would hate to see that genius go to waste.
And if I don't?
You know the answer to that. Aside from this possible Orion catastrophe, which I doubt your humanist ego would allow, you'll be turned over to interrogation, and it won't be cinematic. Either way, you're not leaving the ship.
Okay, Simon. But I have one condition. I want you to put an end to Program UX-83, otherwise known as the Malthusian Mandate.
If you knew about the mandate, why hasn't Concordia leaked it?
Never had a complete picture.
And what do you think you're missing?
Good question. We find it cryptically mentioned in documents related to the GSA's control programs. It appears the mandate was employed in the death of at least 20 million last year alone. How this is occurring and why is not clear. So why don't you enlighten me?
Let me ask you, John. What do you think the greatest form of social control is? Law? Debt? Religion?
And this is what to do with the Malthusian Mandate?
Humor me.
I don't know. How about socialization? People policing each other?
A properly tuned culture does regulate itself, yes.
We've had the same training, Simon. I'm just as aware of what shapes psychology as you are.
Yeah, see, I'm not so sure. I don't think we'd be in this situation if that was really the case.
You mean because I actually believe the world can change? A child's born, biologically programmed to adapt to its environment. It grows, inching through formative years, shaped by the traditions and beliefs of culture. Institutional education introduces structure, creating comfort with authority, regimentation, status,
Nurturing social schema.
and a fundamental insecurity, forged by a deeply unequal world. A world of sanctioned indifference, where compassion is weakness and domination is virtuous.
What survival requires.
In the current arrangement, sure. And this early sense of insecurity has a unique effect. Once childish tendencies we humans are supposed to grow out of, attention-seeking, spoiled self-interest, manipulativeness, bullying, competition, become ingrained, maturity stunted, setting the stage for yet another disciple in the cult of narcissistic individualism.
Poetic.
By the time higher education is reached, formalized academia, the stronghold of the status quo, where natural curiosity may remain, is now further constrained by specialization, myopic focus, detached from the pursuit of knowledge, existing only for the sake of commercial utility.
To define their product.
And ultimately their identity, becoming little more than yet another agent of trade, a civilization reduced to the goal of endless striving, to sell something to someone else.
The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
And so the cog turns. But in those fleeting moments, economic stress does subside. When the shackles do come off, existential turbulence blooms as they desperately search for some kind of deeper meaning in the daily grind. And this emotional void, this state of loss, leads to pathological escapism. Distraction and self-medication become the hobby.
So they turn to their screens, windows of projected normality, equating freedom with the unattainable delusions of wealth, fame, honor.
While constantly being reminded that they are the authors of their own misery. And success can only be a matter of winning versus losing. Since the vast majority will no doubt lose, they live vicariously. If their sports team wins the game, so do they. If their country goes to war, they wave their flags as if they were at war, while following their celebrity heroes, feeling as though somehow that success mirrors their own.
And when that doesn't work, they move inward, seeking self-help retreats, therapy, medication, illicit drugs.
Anything to avoid the identity crisis. That the society they mirror just might be deeply flawed. So the masses remain complacent, short-sighted, bigoted, primitive, delusional.
Manageable. No conspiracy required. Viable systems regulate themselves.
Viable. You see how this says sustainable.
No conspiracy required. Viable systems regulate themselves.
We just picked up the signal.
Now there's one thing you missed in your monologue there. Aside from primal provocation, keeping people half-conscious, trapped in lower brain fight-or-flight mode. Aside from the cultural hegemony where people's values and envies mirror those of wealth and power, reinforcing the social order. And aside from the climate of opinion, fostered by the acclaimed intelligentsia, deciding the limits by which truth must conform. The most critical mechanism here is that of social inclusion. Nature wired us with a strong tendency to override rational thought in favor of group acceptance, part of our evolutionary fitness. And when people violate consensus, the nervous system seeks to correct the behavior with pain and fear, as there's little more psychologically damaging than social exclusion. To be ostracized, ridicule, stigma, loss of reputation, which could also mean loss of employment, income, loss of survival.
Yet there's a long history of people who have moved against that tendency.
A long history of very few people who inevitably turn into mere righteous symbols put on t-shirts rather than forces of revolution.
So this Orion problem of yours isn't indicative of anything?
Orion appears to be a fringe group of extremists with no public support. This is about normative culture. And my point, John, is that given our social nature, the stronger force here is not on the side of reason, it's on the side of inclusion and conformity. And that, my friend, is the greatest form of social control, and why the masses will never break out of its self-perpetuated oppression.
Are they still in debate mode?
Listen for yourself.
Hope you went to college.
And why the masses will never break out of its self-perpetuated oppression.
Historically observable, biologically sound, and grossly exaggerated. While most may indeed be stuck in lower brain limbic system reflexes, you underestimate the prefrontal cortex, our ability to transcend primitive reactions. Whether you believe it or not, Simon, the activists of the world are slowly becoming more aware, more focused.
Focused on what?
The system. The origin of the social psychology that keeps those feedback loops of oppression going.
So, threat to the money god?
If you want to be spooky about it, sure. The money god is eventually going to be overthrown. This age-old march toward increased equality and human rights is now accelerating into new territory. In one way or another, it's eventually going to arrive at the doorstep of the economy.
And then what? You seem to be suffering from a kind of amnesia, John. That moment's long past, immortalized by the failed Soviet experiment, a memory that's fostered an enduring boogeyman. Anyone today daring to suggest economic equality, which is what I assume you're getting at, as some final stage of human rights progress, will quickly be condemned as a freedom-hating socialist.
Propaganda may be strong. So are the mounting problems. Problems that have no in-system solution, forcing people to think differently.
Such as?
How about the collective insult that 1% of the world's population now owns 80% of the wealth? Or more importantly, that every life support system continues to be in decline, with now millions dislocated. Famines, wars, growing poverty. People will eventually realize the economic mechanisms behind this, further opening the gate. Same for technological unemployment. Half of all jobs have already been automated. And while nations have compensated by giving basic income, the system contradiction is still clear. What happens when people realize this welfare program is really just an excuse to keep the labor system in place, hence keeping the ruling class in place?
You assume too much, John. 3/4 of the people on that planet believe in supernatural beings that live in the sky, affecting their lives. You're projecting your rare intelligence upon a sea of glorified savages. And if you think the activist community has anything in their toolkit to even approach system-level change, you're not paying attention to their ignorance.
You mean the spectacle? People piling into free speech zones, holding up signs, yelling at buildings, ranting on social media, creating political art, poetry, writing books, making movies. I agree, it's mostly catharsis.
It's a pressure release valve, easing periodic tension, making people feel like they're actually doing something. Aside, of course, from helping the economy, the anti-establishment market has been increasingly profitable.
Yes, the anger dollar. If only such outrage could be packaged and traded on Wall Street, right?
And then social change might have a chance. But catharsis aside, John, the real issue is hope. Activism today is a hope industry. Take Concordia. It's been irritating, and I'm certainly bothered by the technology you have, but your actions have posed no true threat. What you do is give your millions of fans hope, and hope is a drug that subdues.
So the long history of rights progress is meaningless? The abolition of slavery, women's liberation, child labor laws, unions, indigenous restitution, global decrees, LGBTQ equality, disability acts?
All adaptations and accommodations. No threat to the system itself. Take abject slavery. The origins are clear. It was never about racism.
It was about economic exploitation.
hence business as usual. And yet racism took the heat. The system connection goes unrecognized.
Limits of debate. People have been conditioned to seek moral causes rather than structural ones.
Which is exactly my point. They don't have the vocabulary.
Nothing in their experience offers it. The average person engages 6 hours of media a day. Much of that news constantly reinforcing the status quo.
I'm glad you brought that up. News is a business. And do you think that any for-profit institution is ever going to tolerate ideas that move against how it survives? The odds are stacked, John. The system protects itself on every level, almost as if it were a living organism. But, for argument's sake, let's assume a formidable movement existed, a united front to change the social structure. Then what? Does it play out on the stage of political theater, a stage owned and operated by business power?
Part of the awakening. People are realizing their elected officials are structurally corrupted by default, regardless of intent. Approaches will shift.
To what? Insurrection? Violence? Overthrow? A French Revolution?
Possible, but certainly not inevitable. A critical mass large enough to stop the machine in its tracks is really all that's needed.
You remember George Orwell?
Of course.
He observed something interesting in this endless battle between the haves and the have-nots. If it's true, as you say, the masses are beginning to understand the system, building force against it, you should also recognize that there's a natural counter-movement, the system defending itself once again. And every threat to its integrity, what you see as progress, will be twisted around and presented to the public as an attack on their way of life. Those outliers that you spoke of, the terrorists, gangs, criminals, mass murderers, insurgencies, hackers, the Orions, the Concordians, all empower the system in the end, providing excuses to further tighten things down. More police, more prisons, more laws, more bombs, more surveillance, more control. Again, no conspiracy required. It's the masses themselves that push for this, willfully exchanging their freedom for security, so they can comfortably return to their workstations and continue pulling levers on the machine, just as the money god ordained. And besides, where do you see equality in the animal kingdom? No one's equal, John.
And it'd be painfully boring if they were. Humans are diverse. Everyone has different capabilities, strengths, weaknesses, talents. The push for social equality and human rights is about how that diversity is understood. And you seem to think people should only be valued by how well they compete in the business game, as if the violent spread between the rich and the poor reflects objective human worth.
John, I amuse myself with the notion of the money god because it isn't far from the truth. Some system has to exist to divide up a scarce world, and nature has spoken as to what that system must be. Those who reach the top of the pyramid deserve it, not because you or I think it's right, but because that's what nature's selecting for.
So nature prefers sociopaths and psychopaths to guide the species? Because those are the dominating traits of the ruling class today.
The system is as the system does.
Is that what the Malthusian mandate's about? To then select out the poor and weak?
We'll get to the mandate in a moment. I'm still bothered by your denial of the fact our social system reflects our true biological nature. And if this revolution you speak of did magically occur, it would just be a matter of time before the innate compulsion toward social dominance prevailed yet again. Deep down, John, the slaves don't want to be free. They want to be slave owners.
Nice one. Too bad history paints a different picture.
Power hierarchies have remained constant throughout recorded civilization.
For perhaps the last 12,000 years, sure. You know as well as I do, before the discovery of agriculture, there was no such thing. 99% of human history has been egalitarian.
I said civilization, John. Meandering hunter-gatherer tribes, chucking spears and eating grubs isn't civilization.
How contemporaneous is the view? Yet 20th century study of numerous hunter-gatherer tribes, those still surviving in remote areas, just as they did thousands of years prior, actually show socially rich cultures. Adult lifespans not far from ours, relatively peaceful and balanced with nature. No leaders, no group hierarchy, no inequality. To argue today's society is somehow more civilized is dubious at best.
Well, then, perhaps you can encourage all your enlightened followers to come together and live out their utopian fantasy in the Amazon jungle.
You mean what's left of it? What hasn't been destroyed by the supposedly advanced culture that's ravaged the natural world into total decline in the name of infinite consumption and economic growth? And the point here, Simon, is hunter-gatherer cultures are evidence of human variability. Variability which contradicts your vague biological determinism.
John, just because history shows a range of behaviors across time doesn't prove anything. The introduction of agriculture indeed changed the human condition because it triggered a dormant trait in our evolutionary psychology, a trait that wasn't expressed before.
How?
By the advent of economic surplus.
Economic surplus.
Resources and goods that could be stored, hoarded, stockpiled, owned, traded, controlled, leveraged for personal gain, a phenomenon that was impossible in hunter-gatherer reality. And it was that realization that sparked our now omnipresent drive toward dominance and hierarchy.
I didn't know that. Genetic dormancy of an evolutionary expression needed an environmental trigger, psychological drive that then morphs into complex oppressive institutions and structures. Compelling, intuitive, plausible. Too bad it's total bullshit. Old simpleton, pedestrian, biodeterministic conclusions that are nothing more than elitist projections.
You think it's wise to insult me given this circumstance, John? And listen.
Agriculture did change everything, but not because of some once dormant psychological drive magically triggered by economic surplus. It was about what such a society technically required, dramatically shifting incentives and the very nature of human relationships. Think about it. First, you need the proper land, water, the right conditions to farm, then creating settlements around those fruitful areas as opposed to foraging. And since land quality varies, some settlements will prosper due to their geography, and some will falter. So what happens when a group finds itself with failed crops and no way to survive the winter? They may trade with other groups, building out what we call a market today, giving way to the idea of property, and so on. Or if they have nothing to trade, desperate, they may invade. They may steal, compete, establishing the need for protection, laws, armies, the state institution itself. At the same time, people begin to notice the imbalance and power of this new propertied reality, rationalizing the hoarding of wealth for the sake of future security. Hence the birth of inequity, poverty, socioeconomic class. Simon, every major structural aspect of society today, from ownership to trade, to nation states, to institutional warfare, to the competitive ethic, to vast economic inequality and power hierarchy, was predictable. Snowballing ever since.
So, your theory is if you change the structure of society, you change the human condition? There's no going back, John.
No one's going back. We're going forward. Humanity has been trapped in this immature stage for too long. Not to mention the sickness manifest by this endless striving towards social status is palpable. Children, when who ask what they want to be when they grow up, say, rich and famous. How the most wealthy nations, those beacons of supposed success, are by far the most mentally ill. People don't know who they are, where they're going, or what they're doing, lost in a perversion of social image, a spectacle that no longer has any relationship to anything real.
I'm sorry, Peter. Can we cut?
Cut. What's going on, Greg?
Well, it's this opening section. I'm still not getting it. I know we've been through it, but it's just not landing for me.
I'm just going to keep rolling here. Can you grab that color swatch for me?
You have to think about the interpretation reference to that.
All right. Thank you. God, this tripod head is toilet.
You know, my latte was cold this morning.
And that's my problem because...
Okay. Oh, okay. I think I got it. Thanks.
No problem.
All right, everybody, let's do this.
Jesus. Take a screenwriting class, for Christ's sake. No one's going to understand any of this shit.
Camera. Rolling. Audio.
Speeding.
Slate. 237, take 23.
What if I told you, John, what many see as problems in the world are actually solutions in transition?
Is that some kind of Taoist riddle?
Poverty, crime, war, disease, even the ongoing destruction of the habitat. What if they were actually productive forces, assisting a larger end?
I suggest you lighten up on the Nietzsche.
What separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom is that we have no natural predators. Nothing out there to snatch us up for an afternoon snack. We're also uniquely aware of our own mortality and fight it. With hospitals, medicine, inoculations, little stopping us from reproducing to the very limit of our host. At least not externally. Evolution had to do something a bit different with us. So, instead, we are our own predators. Predator and prey in one.
How convenient.
Which explains not only why humans murder each other at a rate unparalleled by any other species, but also why we've generated a social structure that by systemic force further ensures a consistent rate of premature mortality.
You mean structural violence?
Embedded into the very design of civilization itself.
So that is what the Malthusian Mandate does. Regulate how to kill off the weak.
No, the mandate isn't a policy of action, it's a policy of inaction. A commitment not to interfere with the natural course of the system.
So the invisible hand of the market has a machete.
I don't expect to win you over, John. I'm just telling you the way it is. I agree it's ugly, but without the premature death that capitalism brings in the form of inequality, that planet would have flown off its axis long ago. As you know, the Industrial Revolution set in motion population growth that was hyperbolic. And out of the 70 million who now die each year, 30 million do so because of unequal conditions.
So 40% of all global deaths are structurally inflicted. You know there's a word for that, Simon.
Oh, don't be dramatic. Again, this is system-level behavior, John, not some nefarious conspiracy. You want to know what the population would be if this wasn't the case. If we removed inequality-driven mortality for the last 100 years, accounting for fertility, about 16 billion would be sucking up resources on that planet today, with a carrying capacity still at only 10 billion. And you think things are messy now?
First of all, Simon, when the great Reverend Thomas Malthus decided population would forever outpace resources, only 1 billion existed. We're almost 10 times that now, despite his projections. Second, in the modern era, the greatest predictor of regional overpopulation is poverty itself. If the world ever did abolish it, increasing education, population growth would dramatically slow, likely approaching equilibrium. Your 16 billion number doesn't account for that. And third, you're completely disregarding what the Fullerian study proved long ago, a study sanctioned by your own department.
The Fullerian study was purely theoretical, John. a model only possible if humans magically conform to strict sustainability and efficiency principles. It required a completely egalitarian structure without money and markets, a fantasy, given once again the reality of human nature.
Fantasy or not, the study was clear. Not only can the Earth hold upwards of 30 billion, it can do so with each having a standard of living equivalent to today's upper middle class.
Yeah, again assuming equal distribution, which is absurd. Humans have infinite wants.
No, they don't. Infinite wants is a value disorder, inspired by an economy that needs infinite consumption to work. People are just as prone to be minimalist as they are materialist. It comes down to the social condition. Today, if people didn't have highly acquisitive values, the entire economy would collapse.
Fine. Believe what you will, John. It's all moot anyway. You asked me what the Malthusian Mandate was, and I'm telling you. Whether you like it or not, this is the reality of things today.
We got mandate metadata. Please tell me this is recording.
It certainly is.
Looks like John got his subterfuge.
So how's this organized then? Tracking demographics and mechanism?
We are. As you'll notice, conditions related to absolute poverty in the third world countries account for about 40% of all premature deaths.
And I see you're also tracking poverty-related illness and violence in the industrialized nations.
With heart disease, cancer, and diabetes remaining at the top, while suicide, inner-city gang warfare, and drug overdoses coming a close second.
What about deep systemic relationships? Lack of education, childhood stress?
Correlated as well. Actually, very consistent. Regional cycles of deprivation are like clockwork. Poor families continue to produce more poor families, even in the richest states.
And the mechanisms?
Standard class war stuff. Only difference now is the ecological and climate crisis, which has rapidly increased mortality in poverty-stricken desert and coastal regions. But the same story otherwise. The rich get richer with disproportional opportunity and capital. The political establishment favors business and wealthy interests over social support programs. And the banking system keeps a solid stranglehold on social mobility by saturating the lower class in insurmountable debt. Same on the global level. Through international finance institutions, structural adjustments, austerity, sanctions. In fact, the financial system is really the glue that holds all this together, keeping constant downward pressure on the impecunious masses.
And it's at this juncture, Simon, I'm afraid I have to deliver some kind of protagonistical declaration of moral superiority to indicate the philosophical error of your ways. So here it goes. Those that seek to create in this world, those who embrace change as a natural force, helping to unify humankind as one entity in one shared direction, realizing that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, will always be one step ahead of the traditionalists, the preservers, the elitists, who in defense of their separatist identities and egoist fears, seek to divide, conquer, oppress, and destroy. The pursuit of livingry will always be one step ahead of the pursuit of weaponry.